The thing Michael couldn't stop staring at wasn't the man standing next to Jenica, it was her smile. 3 years earlier, she used to look at him like that when he came home late from work, even if dinner had gone cold, even if he was tired and irritated and barely said 2 words when he walked through the door. Now it was almost 11 at night, and Michael was sitting alone in a cramped apartment in Queens with takeout noodles in his lap and a broken radiator making that knocking sound old buildings make in the winter. His phone buzzed. Tasha had posted a picture. Jenica was standing in a park in Brooklyn with a little girl on her hip. There was a man beside her, one hand resting gently against her back, like he'd been there a long time. But Michael barely noticed him. He kept staring at Jenica because she looked lighter, happier, like somebody who had finally stopped waiting for an apology she was never going to get. Under the picture, Tasha had written, "Some people finally find the life they deserve." Michael sat there for a long time with the screen glowing in his hand. 3 years earlier, he had left his wife for the woman he thought he had always wanted. 3 years later, he finally understood what he had thrown away. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. Jenica grew up in a brownstone on a quiet block in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where everybody knew everybody else's business, whether they admitted it or not. On summer mornings, her grandmother would open the front windows before 7 and yell at her cousins to stop running up and down the stairs like wild animals. "Andre, if you break your neck in this house, don't expect me to pay for it." "I'm not gonna break my neck, Grandma. You already broke my lamp last week." By the time Jenica came downstairs, somebody was always in the kitchen. Her mother, Denise, making coffee before work. Her grandmother frying bacon in an old cast-iron skillet that had been around longer than anybody could remember. One of her cousins digging through the refrigerator even though breakfast wasn't ready yet. The house was crowded, in the way old family houses often are. Too many people, too much noise. Shoes by the front door, plastic grocery bags stuffed inside other plastic grocery bags. An aunt calling from downstairs because she needed to borrow sugar and staying for an hour. Jenica loved it. On Sundays, the block came alive before noon. Men sat outside on folding chairs arguing about basketball and politics. Somebody always had music playing through an open window. Most weeks, it was gospel, sometimes old soul music. The smell of fried chicken and collard greens floated through the street from apartment windows. When Jenica was 12, she used to sit on the front steps beside her grandmother and watch people walk by. "You see Miss Evelyn?" her grandmother said one afternoon, nodding toward a woman hurrying down the sidewalk in high heels. "The one with the red purse?" She wasn't like that before. "Like what?" Her grandmother leaned back in the folding chair. Her son started making good money. Now suddenly she talks different, dresses different, acts like she don't know nobody. Jenica looked over. Miss Evelyn had lived on their block her whole life, but lately she barely stopped to say hello. "Why do people do that?" Jenica asked. "Because money doesn't change people, baby. It just makes them more of who they already are." At the time, Jenica didn't fully understand what her grandmother meant. She understood better a few years later. By 14, she knew her father was rich. Not regular rich, the kind of rich where people wore expensive watches that looked plain on purpose. The kind of rich where men in suits called his office and spoke softer when they realized who they were talking to. Her father lived in Manhattan, in a building with a doorman and marble floors. He sent cars for her sometimes. He sent birthday gifts that cost too much. He paid for private school when her mother finally gave in and let him, but he was never really there. He missed school plays, forgot birthdays more than once, showed up with apologies and shopping bags, and acted like that was the same thing. One Saturday afternoon, when Jenica was 16, he took her to lunch at a restaurant so expensive she was afraid to touch anything. The waiter called him sir every 5 seconds. People kept stopping at the table to shake his hand. When he stepped away to take a phone call, the woman sitting at the next table smiled at Jenica. "Your father is an extraordinary man." Jenica looked at the woman. She had never seen her before in her life. "Do you know him?" The woman smiled wider. "Not personally." That answer stayed with Jenica. People were always nicer when they found out who her father was. Teachers who ignored her suddenly became interested. Distant relatives started inviting her places. One cousin asked if her father could help pay for a car before even asking how she was doing. The older she got, the more she hated it. By the time she was in college, she had learned not to tell people about him at all. If somebody asked about her family, she talked about her mother, who worked 2 jobs for years and still made it to every school event. She talked about her grandmother, who could make a meal out of almost nothing and somehow feed 10 people with it. She talked about the cousins who drove her crazy and loved her anyway. She never talked about the trust fund, never talked about the money quietly sitting in an account with her name on it. At 2008, Jenica had enough money that she could have lived almost anywhere in New York. Her best friend, Tasha, reminded her of that every few weeks. One Saturday morning, they were standing in line at a coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights. Jenica had on an old thrift store jacket, jeans, and boots that cost more than the jacket, though nobody would have guessed. Tasha looked around the tiny apartment listing Jenica had pulled up on her phone and nearly choked on her coffee. "This is where you're moving?" Jenica looked down at the listing. It was a 1-bedroom walk-up with a narrow kitchen and a living room barely big enough for a couch. "It's fine." "Fine?" Tasha stared at her. "Jenica, your father owns half of Manhattan." "Not half. A third, then." "The point is, you could be living in Tribeca in some giant apartment with a view." Jenica folded her phone and shrugged. "I don't want that." "You don't want a nice apartment?" "I want a real life." Tasha laughed. "You are the only rich girl I know who acts broke on purpose." Jenica smiled a little. "I'm not broke on purpose. I'm normal on purpose." A week later, she signed the lease. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building in Brooklyn Heights. The floors creaked. The radiator banged in the middle of the night. The kitchen was so small, she had to stand sideways to open the oven. She loved it immediately. That first night, she sat cross-legged on the living room floor, eating Chinese takeout straight from the carton, while the windows rattled softly from the wind outside. For the first time in a long time, her life felt like it belonged to her. Michael grew up in Staten Island in a narrow 2-story house with faded beige siding and a driveway that was always full of somebody else's car. His father worked construction 6 days a week and came home smelling like sawdust, sweat, and cigarette smoke. His mother worked part-time at a dentist's office and believed there were only 3 things a man needed in life: a steady paycheck, a decent suit, and enough pride not to ask anybody for help. Michael learned early that nobody in his house talked much about feelings. If he came home upset because kids at school made fun of his hand-me-down sneakers, his father barely looked up from the television. "You want better shoes?" he said. "Then work hard and buy better shoes someday." When Michael got his first B in high school, his mother put the report card on the kitchen table and tapped the grade with her fingernail. "You are too smart for this," she said. "People don't respect men who waste their potential." Nobody ever said they were proud of him exactly. Not when he graduated college. Not when he got his first office job in Manhattan. Not even when he was 29 and bought his first condo in Staten Island with money he'd saved for years. His father only walked through the condo once, hands shoved in his pockets. "Mortgage is probably killing you," he said. Michael laughed like it didn't bother him. Later that night, sitting alone on the floor because he hadn't bought furniture yet, he stared around the condo and felt something hollow open up in his chest. He had spent his whole life trying to become the kind of man people respected, and somehow it never felt like enough. By 35, Michael worked in commercial real estate. He wore good suits now, not great ones, but good enough. He learned how to shake hands firmly, how to talk in meetings, how to sound confident even when he wasn't. The truth was, most days he still felt like the kid with the cheap sneakers, especially around men with more money than him. At networking events, he noticed everything: the watches, the private school stories, the way certain men spoke like they had never once worried about paying rent. Michael always felt like he was one wrong sentence away from people realizing he didn't belong there. That was part of why Chloe had hurt him so badly. He met her when he was 24. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made people turn around when she walked into a room. Blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, expensive taste even when she couldn't afford it. At first, Michael thought she loved him. For 2 years, they built a life together in a tiny apartment in Queens with peeling paint and a broken dishwasher that never got fixed. They talked about marriage, kids, the future. When he proposed, Chloe cried. 6 months later, she left him. It happened on a Thursday night. Michael had come home carrying takeout and a bottle of cheap wine because Chloe had been stressed all week. Instead, he walked into the apartment and found 2 suitcases by the front door. Chloe was standing in the kitchen in a long coat, checking her reflection in the microwave. "What is this?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she sighed. "I can't do this anymore, Michael." He laughed because he thought she was joking. "What are you talking about?" "You have no ambition." He stared at her. "I work 60 hours a week." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Chloe crossed her arms. "You think this is enough?" She looked around the apartment when she said it. At the stained carpet, the old cabinets, the leak in the ceiling they had stopped noticing. "You are always talking about someday," she said. "Someday you'll make more money. Someday you'll get promoted. Someday we'll move somewhere better." "I'm trying." "I know," she said quietly. "But trying isn't the same thing." Then she picked up her suitcase and left. A week later, Michael found out she was dating a man 10 years older who owned restaurants in Manhattan. For a long time, he told people he didn't care. When his younger brother, Danny, asked about her one Sunday, Michael shrugged. "She did me a favor." Danny looked at him across the diner booth. "No, she didn't." Michael stirred cream into his coffee and changed the subject, but he carried Chloe with him longer than he wanted to admit. Not because he still loved her, because some part of him believed she had been right. No matter what he accomplished, there was always a voice in the back of his mind whispering that he still wasn't enough. That voice followed him everywhere. It followed him to work. It followed him to expensive bars, where men talked about investments and vacations and second homes. It followed him home at night, when he loosened his tie and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, wondering why he still felt so small. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon in October, his boss called and told him he had to meet a client in Park Slope. By the time Michael got off the subway, the rain was coming down hard enough to soak through his jacket in less than a block. He ducked into the first place he saw, a small bookstore cafe on a corner with steamed-up windows and a bell over the door. Inside, he tried to juggle his phone, his coffee, and the folder under his arm. The coffee spilled straight down the front of his white shirt. "Unbelievable," he muttered, staring at the dark stains spreading across his chest. From somewhere behind him, a woman laughed, not loudly, just enough to make him turn around. She was standing near the back shelves with a tote bag over one shoulder and rain in her hair. For the first time all day, Michael forgot about the stain. Michael looked down at the coffee spreading across his shirt and then back at the woman. "You think this is funny?" he asked. She pressed her lips together like she was trying not to smile again. "A little." "That's cold." "You'll survive." He glanced down at himself. The stain had somehow managed to land directly in the center of his shirt, exactly where everybody in his meeting would notice it. "I have a client meeting in 20 minutes. The woman stepped closer and set her tote bag on one of the cafe tables. "Hold on." She dug through the bag for a second, moving aside a notebook, a paperback novel with a bent cover, and what looked like 3 granola bars. Then she pulled out a Tide pen and held it up. Michael stared at it. "You just carry that around?" She shrugged. "Brooklyn subway rule. If you leave the house looking nice, life will try to humble you." For the first time all day, he laughed. She handed him the pen. "I'm Jenica." "Michael." He uncapped the Tide pen and looked down at his shirt helplessly. "I have no idea how to use this." Jenica reached for it. "Give me that before you make it worse." "You seem very confident for someone helping a complete stranger in a bookstore." "I volunteer with children," she said. "Compared to that, you're easy." She stepped closer and started dabbing at the stain. Michael noticed she smelled faintly like rain and coffee. "You volunteer?" he asked. "I work at a non-profit arts program in Brooklyn." "What kind of arts program?" "The kind where 8-year-olds cover themselves in paint and then somehow blame me." He smiled. "And you carry emergency stain supplies, and Band-Aids, and ibuprofen, and enough snacks to survive a natural disaster. You sound prepared for everything." Jenica looked up at him. "No," she said softly. "Just the things that usually go wrong." For a second, neither of them said anything. Then the barista behind the counter called out an order, And the moment broke. Jenica handed the Tide pen back to him. There. Better. Michael looked down. The stain was still there, but lighter. You just saved my life. Let's not get dramatic. I owe you coffee. She glanced toward the cup in his hand. You already have coffee. Then I owe you a coffee that doesn't end up on my shirt. Jenica hesitated. Normally, she would have said no. There had been enough awkward dates and disappointing conversations over the years that she had stopped expecting much from people. But there was something about Michael. Maybe it was the way he looked embarrassed instead of arrogant. Maybe it was that he seemed like somebody who had spent a long time trying very hard. Okay, she said. They sat at a small table by the window, while rain slid down the glass outside. Michael told her about his job in commercial real estate, and immediately felt boring halfway through explaining it. Jenica listened anyway, not politely, not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to talk. She actually listened. When he mentioned that he hated networking events, she laughed. You work in commercial real estate and hate networking? I know. It's like being a lifeguard who can't swim. No, it's worse. At least the lifeguard could still yell for help. He laughed hard enough that the woman at the next table looked over. By the time he finally glanced at his watch, he was already 10 minutes late. Damn. You should go, Jenica said. I know. He didn't move. Then finally he stood up and grabbed his folder. Can I see you again? Jenica looked down at her coffee for a second. Then she smiled. Depends. On what? Whether you survive your meeting. 3 days later, they met again. Michael took her to a cheap pizza place near Prospect Park because he didn't want to pretend to be somebody he wasn't. The restaurant had plastic cups, wobbly tables, and a guy behind the counter yelling at somebody in Spanish. Jenica seemed perfectly happy there. She folded her slice in half and looked at him. So, what happened to the shirt? What shirt? The coffee shirt. Oh, I threw it out. Her eyes widened. Because of one stain? It was ruined. Jenica shook her head. You definitely grew up in a family where people threw things away instead of fixing them. Michael laughed. You don't know my family. No, she said, but I know mine. My grandmother would have washed that shirt 3 times and then turned it into a cleaning rag. The more time they spent together, the easier it felt. They walked through Prospect Park after dinner, while the trees were turning orange and red. They argued about music. You cannot honestly believe old Motown is better than 90s R&B, Jenica said. It is better. It is older. Which means it's better. You sound 80. You sound wrong. She laughed so hard she had to stop walking. A week later, they stayed out too late walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. The city lights reflected off the water. Cars moved below them. The air was cold enough that Jenica shoved her hands into the pockets of her coat. Michael glanced at her. You cold? I'm fine. You are absolutely not fine. Before she could argue, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him. You don't have to do that. I know. For a second, they just stood there in the middle of the bridge with the city around them. Then Jenica smiled. Not the polite smile she gave strangers. Something softer, something real. Over the next few months, they built something small and steady. Cheap dinners, Sunday mornings, text messages in the middle of work. Michael learned that Jenica always drank coffee too fast, and then complained it was gone. Jenica learned that Michael secretly loved old Motown songs, even though he pretended not to. He learned she always carried too much in her bag. She learned he called his younger brother Danny every Sunday because their father never called either of them first. One night, they were sitting on the fire escape outside Jenica's apartment, eating Chinese takeout straight from the carton. The street below was noisy. Somebody was arguing across the block. A siren passed in the distance. Michael looked over at her. You know what's weird? What? I feel like I've known you longer than I have. Jenica leaned back against the brick wall. Maybe that's because you're talking more than you usually do. He smiled a little. No. It's because with most people, I always feel like I have to prove something. Jenica looked at him quietly. And with me? Michael looked down at the carton in his hands. For most of his life, he had felt like he was always reaching for something. Approval, respect, enough. But sitting beside Jenica in the dark, He didn't feel like he had to earn anything. "With you," he said softly, "I feel like I can just be myself." Jenica didn't say anything right away. She just reached over and took his hand, and for the first time in years, Michael felt seen. Michael knew Jenica's family was going to be intense before he ever walked through the front door. "You don't have to be nervous," Jenica said as they stood outside her mother's brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant on a cold Sunday afternoon. "I'm not nervous. You fixed your collar 3 times. Michael dropped his hand from his collar immediately. "I just want them to like me." Jenica smiled and reached for his hand. "They'll like you." Then she paused. "My grandmother might insult you, but that's basically the same thing." Before Michael could ask what that meant, the front door swung open. Tasha was standing there holding a bowl of potato salad. "You must be Michael," she said. "Come in before Grandma Ruth starts yelling that the food's getting cold." The second Michael stepped inside, he felt like he had walked into another world. The house was loud. Music was playing somewhere in the back. Somebody in the kitchen was laughing so hard they snorted. 2 little kids ran through the hallway, nearly knocking into him before a woman he didn't know grabbed them both by the shirts. "Stop running before you kill somebody." The whole house smelled like fried chicken, onions, garlic, and something sweet baking in the oven. Jenica took off her coat. "My mother is in the kitchen. My Uncle Leon is probably arguing with somebody about sports. My cousins are everywhere. And my grandmother." "Is about to inspect me?" Michael guessed. "Absolutely." As if on cue, an older woman walked out of the dining room carrying a dish towel over her shoulder. She looked Michael up and down without smiling. This was Grandma Ruth. She was small, sharp-eyed, and somehow looked like she had been running the house for the last 50 years without ever needing anybody's help. She said. Michael straightened up without meaning to. "You too skinny." The whole room burst out laughing. Jenica buried her face in Michael's shoulder. "Grandma, I'm serious," Grandma Ruth said. "Boy looks like one strong wind could carry him off the porch. Jenica, feed this man." Michael laughed awkwardly. "I eat." "Not enough." Then, just as quickly, she patted his cheek and walked back toward the kitchen. Michael stared after her. Was that good or bad? Jenica grinned. "Very good." The afternoon got louder from there. Michael met Jenica's mother, Denise, who hugged him before he even had time to introduce himself. "So you're the man making my daughter smile all the time," she said. "I hope so." "You better be." Then she smiled to let him know she was joking. Mostly, in the living room, Uncle Leon was sitting in an armchair arguing with Jenica's cousin Marcus about baseball. "I'm telling you, the Mets have no pitching." They've been saying that since 1998, because it's still true. When Jenica introduced Michael, Uncle Leon barely looked up. "You Yankee fan or Mets fan?" Michael hesitated. "Yankees." The room went quiet. Then Marcus pointed at him. "Oh, absolutely not." For the next 20 minutes, Michael got pulled into a loud argument about baseball he didn't understand, and somehow ended up defending a team he didn't even care that much about. And somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped feeling nervous, because nobody in Jenica's family was pretending. They interrupted each other. They talked too loud. They made fun of each other. They argued and laughed in the same sentence. Nobody cared what kind of watch he wore or what he did for a living. Nobody asked him how much money he made. At dinner, there were too many people for the table, so somebody dragged in folding chairs from the basement. There were plates of fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, cornbread, candied yams, and a peach cobbler cooling on the counter. Michael sat between Jenica and her youngest cousin, 13-year-old Aaliyah, who looked at him suspiciously. "So what do you do?" she asked. "I work in commercial real estate." Aaliyah blinked. "What does that even mean?" "It means he wears a tie and sends emails," Jenica said. Everybody laughed. "That's not all I do." "Okay," Jenica said. "Sometimes he also sits in meetings and pretends not to be annoyed." Michael looked at her. "You make me sound boring." "You are a little boring." He laughed despite himself. Halfway through dinner, Grandma Ruth looked at Michael's plate and frowned. "That's all you're eating?" Michael looked down. His plate was already full. "Yes?" She scooped another spoonful of macaroni onto his plate. "Anyway, you still too skinny." After dinner, Michael ended up in the kitchen helping Aaliyah with math homework because she'd been hiding from it all afternoon. "I hate fractions," she said dramatically. "You don't hate fractions," Michael said. "You hate homework." "Same thing." Across the room, Jenica was helping her mother wrap leftovers in foil. Every once in a while, she glanced over at him. The look on her face made something in Michael's chest ache in a way he didn't understand, because nobody had ever looked at him like that before, like he already belonged. By the time they finally left, it was almost 10 o'clock. They stood together on the subway platform while a cold wind moved through the station. Michael shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I think your family just interrogated me for 6 straight hours. Jenica smiled. "You survived." "Barely. Your uncle thinks I know nothing about baseball." "You do know nothing about baseball." "That's not the point." The train still hadn't come. Michael looked over at her. "So, do they like me?" Jenica pretended to think about it. "My grandmother only insulted you twice." "That's good?" "Very." Then she stepped closer. "They like you, Michael." "How can you tell?" "Because you were in the kitchen helping Aaliyah with fractions, and my mother already asked me if you know how to fix things around the house." He laughed. "And what did you say?" "I said probably not." "Wow." "But I also told her, you have other qualities." Michael smiled. Before he could answer, Jenica reached up, grabbed the front of his coat, and kissed him. The subway roared into the station a few seconds later. But for the first time in a very long time, Michael didn't feel like he was standing outside looking in. He felt like he had finally found somewhere he belonged. Michael proposed on a Tuesday night in their apartment in Brooklyn Heights. There was no reservation at an expensive restaurant, no hidden photographer, no speech he had practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. Jenica was sitting on the kitchen counter eating Chinese takeout while complaining that somebody in the building kept stealing packages from the lobby. "I am telling you," she said, pointing a chopstick at him, "it is the guy in apartment 2B. Nobody that friendly is actually that friendly." Michael was barely listening. The ring box had been in his jacket pocket all evening, and he had nearly dropped it twice. "You okay?" Jenica asked. "Yeah." "You look like you're about to throw up." "I am not going to throw up." "You look pale." Michael laughed nervously and stood up. "Jenica." The way he said her name made her stop talking. He reached into his pocket. Immediately, her eyes widened. "Oh my God." "I know this isn't exactly romantic," he said quickly, "and I know I should have probably planned something better, but every time I try to think of the perfect moment, I keep thinking that my favorite moments with you are just this." Jenica stared at him. Her hair was messy. She was wearing one of his old sweatshirts. There was a carton of lo mein on the counter beside her. Michael dropped to one knee. "I have spent most of my life feeling like I had to earn everything," he said. "Respect, success, love. But with you, I never feel like I have to prove anything. I just get to be myself." Jenica was already crying. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time," he admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever have all the answers, but I know I want every version of my life to have you in it." He opened the ring box. "Will you marry me?" Jenica covered her mouth with both hands. Then she laughed through her tears. "You idiot," she whispered. Michael's face fell. Before he could panic, she jumped off the counter and threw her arms around him. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." They got married 9 months later, in Jenica's mother's backyard in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The whole family had spent the week getting ready. Uncle Leon hung string lights across the fence and complained the entire time. "I should have charged y'all for this," he muttered from the ladder. "You complain every time somebody asks you to do anything," Denise yelled from below. "Because nobody appreciates me." "Nobody asked you to wear a Yankees hat to a wedding either, but here we are." By the morning of the wedding, the backyard looked beautiful. Not expensive, beautiful. There were folding chairs set up in uneven rows, white flowers in mason jars, a long table covered in food, waiting under aluminum foil in the kitchen. Tasha had spent an hour trying to make the cake look professional. "It leans a little," she admitted. "It's fine," Jenica said. "It leans a lot." "It still tastes good." Jenica got ready upstairs in her old bedroom. Her dress was simple, white, soft, nothing flashy. Her grandmother stood behind her. carefully buttoning the back with hands that had gotten slower over the years. For a minute, neither of them spoke. Then Grandma Ruth looked at her in the mirror. "You sure about this man?" Jenica smiled. "Yes." Grandma Ruth nodded once. "Good, because if he hurts you, we bury him in the backyard." Jenica laughed so hard she almost cried again. Downstairs, Michael stood in the yard in a navy suit that didn't fit quite right because he had bought it on sale and then waited too long to get it tailored. Danny stood beside him, adjusting his tie. "You look terrified." "I am terrified. You know she's going to say yes, right? She already moved in with you." "That's not helping." Then the music started. Michael looked up, and there she was. Jenica walked slowly through the backyard, with her hand tucked through Denise's arm. For a second, everything else disappeared. The people, the music, the noise. It was just her. Michael had seen beautiful women before, but he had never seen anyone look the way Jenica looked in that moment. Not because of the dress, because she looked at him like she was coming home. By the time she reached him, Michael was already crying. "You are absolutely not allowed to laugh at me," he whispered. "I would never," Jenica said, already smiling. The ceremony itself was short. The pastor spoke about love being something you build, not something you stumble into. Then it was time for the vows. Jenica went first. Her hand shook a little as she unfolded the paper. "When I met you," she said, "you acted like you had to be perfect all the time." The guests laughed softly. "You wanted everybody to think you had everything under control. But then I got to know you. I got to know the real you, the man who worries too much, the man who pretends he doesn't like old Motown songs even though he knows every word, the man who calls his brother every Sunday because he doesn't want him to feel alone." Michael looked down, embarrassed and emotional all at once. "You make people feel safe," Jenica said quietly. "You make me feel safe. And no matter what happens, no matter how hard life gets, I promise I will never stop choosing you." By the time she finished, Michael had tears running down his face. Then it was his turn. He looked down at the folded paper in his hands. Then he put it away. "I wrote something," he said. "But if I read it, I'm probably just going to cry harder." Everybody laughed. Michael looked at Jenica. "I spent most of my life trying to become the kind of man people would respect," he said. "I thought if I worked hard enough, made enough money, said all the right things, eventually I'd finally feel like enough." He swallowed. "Then I met you." Jenica's eyes filled with tears again. "You loved me before I had anything impressive to offer. You loved me when I was insecure and stubborn and scared. You make me feel like I don't have to earn love." The yard had gone completely quiet. "You are my favorite part of my life," Michael said softly. "And I promise, for the rest of my life, I will never forget what a gift that is." Jenica started crying. So did Denise. Even Uncle Leon wiped his eyes and pretended he had something in them. That night, after everybody had gone home and the backyard was quiet again, Michael and Jenica sat alone on the back steps, still wearing their wedding clothes. Inside, somebody had forgotten to turn off the music. Old Motown drifted softly through the open window. Jenica leaned her head against Michael's shoulder. "You know," she said, "for a man who claimed he didn't like Motown, you requested a lot of Motown songs tonight." Michael smiled. "I was emotional. You were crying before I even got down the aisle. I was overwhelmed. You were a mess. I married you anyway." She laughed and kissed him. For the next 2 years, life stayed small in the best way. They kept the apartment in Brooklyn Heights. Michael worked long hours. Jenica stayed at the arts program. They argued about bills and whose turn it was to do laundry. They ordered too much takeout. They stayed up late watching old movies from the couch. On Sunday mornings, Michael made terrible pancakes and insisted they were good. "They're raw in the middle," Jenica said one morning. "They are rustic. They are dangerous." But she still ate them. At night, they lay in bed talking about the future. Maybe a house someday, maybe kids, maybe a dog, even though Jenica kept saying no and Michael kept sending her pictures of golden retrievers. For the first time in his life, Michael stopped feeling like he was chasing something. He had a wife who loved him, a home, a life that felt real. And sitting beside Jenica on their old couch one quiet night, her feet in his lap and the television on low in the background, Michael honestly believed he had finally built everything he had ever wanted. The first big change came on a Wednesday afternoon. Michael called Jenica from work so suddenly that she almost dropped the paintbrush she was holding. At the arts program, 3 second graders were arguing over glitter. Somebody had spilled juice on the floor, and one little boy was crying because another kid told him his papier-mâché dinosaur looked like a chicken. Jenica stepped into the hallway and answered. "Hey, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Michael said, breathless. "I got it." "You got what?" "The Henderson account." Jenica leaned against the wall. "The Henderson account? I thought they already picked another firm." "So did I, but they called this morning. They changed their minds." Michael sounded different, lighter, excited in a way she had not heard in a long time. "Michael, that's amazing." "I know. I still don't understand it." He laughed to himself. "My boss looked at me like I had personally cured cancer." Jenica smiled. "You deserved it." That night, Michael came home carrying a bottle of wine they could not really afford. He kissed her the second he walked through the door. "I think this changes everything," he said. They drank wine from mismatched glasses because 2 of theirs had broken months earlier, and they never replaced them. Michael talked for an hour straight about the account, the people he met, the possibility of a promotion. Jenica sat cross-legged on the couch listening to him. Every once in a while, he stopped and shook his head like he still could not believe it. "I've worked for this for years," he said quietly. "I know. No, really, for years." Jenica reached over and took his hand. "I know." What Michael did not know was that 2 months earlier, Jenica had been sitting in her father's office in Manhattan. She hated going there. Everything about the building made her uncomfortable. The receptionist who suddenly became too friendly when she walked in, the silent elevator, the office with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked expensive in a cold, joyless way. Her father was sitting behind his desk reading something on his phone when she walked in. He looked up, surprised. "Jenica, hi." He stood to hug her, but there was always something awkward about his hugs, like he was trying to make up for years of not knowing how. "You look good," he said. "You always say that when you don't know what else to say." He smiled a little. "There." They sat across from each other. For a minute, neither of them said anything. Their relationship had always been like that. Not bad exactly, just unfinished. Finally, her father folded his hands. "So, what do you need?" Jenica looked out the window. She hated that he knew she only came when she needed something, but he was not wrong. "It's Michael." Her father's expression changed slightly. He had met Michael twice. He liked him well enough, though he thought Michael tried too hard to impress people. "What about him?" "He's good at what he does." Her father nodded. "I know. He works harder than anybody I know." Another nod. Jenica looked down at her hands. "He keeps getting close to opportunities, and then somebody with more connections gets there first." Her father leaned back in his chair. "What are you asking me?" Jenica took a breath. "I want you to help him." Her father was quiet. "You want me to invest in him?" "No." "You want me to hire him?" "No." "Then what?" She looked at him. "I just want people to give him a chance." Her father studied her face for a long moment. "You really love him?" Jenica smiled softly. "Yes." Her father turned slowly in his chair and looked out at the city. "I can make a few calls." Jenica nodded. Then quickly, before he could say anything else, she added, "But he can't know." Her father turned back toward her. "Why not?" "Because he'll hate it." "He'll appreciate it eventually." "No." She shook her head. "You don't understand, Michael." Her father almost smiled. "Probably not." Jenica leaned forward. "He has spent his whole life feeling like he has to earn everything. If he thinks I handed him something." She stopped for a second. "It would make him feel small." Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "All right. You promise?" "I promise." And he kept that promise. He never called Michael directly. He called other people. A man at an investment firm, somebody on the board of a real estate company, an old friend who played golf with the owner of the Henderson account. The opportunities came quietly. A recommendation here, an introduction there. By the time the Henderson account came through, it did not look like luck. It looked like Michael had finally gotten noticed. Then came the second account, then a promotion, then invitations to dinners and networking events where Michael used to feel invisible. Now people shook his hand first. They remembered his name. One Friday night, he came home carrying a suit bag over his shoulder. Jenica looked up from the couch. "What's that?" Michael grinned. "My new suit." "You bought a new suit?" "I had to." He unzipped the bag. The suit was charcoal gray and definitely more expensive than anything he had ever owned before. Jenica raised an eyebrow. "How much was it?" Michael looked away. "Michael, it was on sale." "Michael," he sighed, $800. Jenica nearly choked on her tea. "For a suit?" "It is an investment." "In what? Becoming Batman?" Michael laughed, but he still held the suit up in front of himself and looked at it with the kind of pride she had never seen before. A month later, she stood in the bedroom doorway watching him knot his tie before another business dinner. He looked good, more confident, straighter somehow. "You know," he said, looking at himself in the mirror, "I think people are finally starting to see what I can do." Jenica smiled. They should have seen it a long time ago. Michael turned toward her. For a second, he looked like the same man she had fallen in love with. He walked over, kissed her forehead, and grabbed his keys. "I'll be home by 10. After he left, Jenica stood alone in the quiet apartment. Then her phone rang. It was her father. "How's your husband?" he asked. Jenica looked toward the door Michael had just walked through. "Happy," she said softly. "And you?" Jenica smiled to herself. "I'm happy because he is." She never told Michael the truth, not because she wanted credit, because she loved the look on his face when he finally started believing in himself. The first time Michael lied to Jenica, it was small enough that he convinced himself it did not count. The night of the fundraiser, Jenica was sitting on the couch in sweatpants with the lights off and one arm draped over her eyes. The migraine had started that afternoon. By 6 o'clock, she had barely moved. "You should still go," she said when Michael came out of the bedroom adjusting his tie. "You sure?" Jenica nodded without opening her eyes. "If I go, I am just going to spend the whole night hiding in somebody's bathroom with the lights off." Michael walked over and sat on the edge of the couch. "You want me to stay?" For a second, Jenica almost said yes. Her head hurt. The apartment was too quiet. She hated these events anyway, and lately it felt like she saw less and less of him, even when he was home. But Michael looked excited. He had spent the last hour changing ties and checking his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "No," she said softly. "Go. You worked hard for this." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'll bring you back dessert." Jenica smiled with her eyes still closed. "Only if it's chocolate." The fundraiser was in a hotel ballroom in Midtown Manhattan. Everything about it made Michael feel important. The chandeliers, the men in dark suits, the women in dresses that probably cost more than his first car. 3 years earlier, he would have stood near the bar pretending to check his phone. Now people recognized him. They shook his hand, asked about work, introduced him to other people. Michael stood near the auction table, holding a glass of whiskey and trying not to enjoy it too much. "Michael?" The voice hit him before he even turned around. He knew that voice. When he looked up, Chloe was standing in front of him. For a second, the room disappeared. She looked almost exactly the same, maybe better. Her hair was longer. She was wearing a black dress and heels that looked expensive without trying too hard. There was something polished about her now, something that made her seem like she belonged in a room like this. Michael stared at her. "Chloe," she smiled slowly. "Wow. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." She looked him up and down, not in a cruel way, not like before. This time there was something else in her expression, something close to surprise. "You look." She paused. Successful. The word landed somewhere deep inside him. Successful. It was exactly the word he had spent his whole life wanting to hear, and somehow, hearing it from Chloe mattered more than it should have. Michael gave a small laugh. "I've been doing okay." "Clearly." She glanced around the ballroom. "I heard your name earlier. Somebody said you're working on that big waterfront project in Brooklyn." Michael nodded. "Yeah, that's impressive." He looked at her. Years ago, when Chloe left him, she had looked at him like he was a man she had already outgrown. Now she was looking at him like she regretted it, and that feeling was dangerous. They stood near the bar talking for almost an hour. Chloe told him she had started a luxury consulting business. "We work with high-end brands," she said. "Hotels, fashion, travel, mostly international clients." She said it casually, but every sentence seemed designed to make her life sound bigger than everybody else's. Paris, Miami, Aspen, investors, launch parties. Michael listened. Part of him hated himself for how much he cared. He told himself it was just curiosity, that he only wanted to prove to himself he no longer cared what Chloe thought. But every time she smiled at him, every time she touched his arm lightly when she laughed, he felt something old waking up inside him, something insecure, something young, something that still wanted her to see him as enough. At one point, Chloe tilted her head. "So, are you married?" Michael hesitated. The hesitation only lasted a second. But it was there. "Yeah," he said finally. "Her name is Jenica." Chloe nodded slowly. "Is she here?" "No. Migraine." "That's too bad." Michael looked at her. "You?" Chloe gave a little shrug. "No husband. I guess I got too busy building an empire." Michael laughed. The auction started. People moved toward the tables. But even while somebody in a tuxedo talked about charity and tax deductions and silent bids, Michael kept glancing at Chloe. At the end of the night, she touched his arm again. "It was good seeing you." "You too." Then she smiled. "You should give me your number." Michael looked down at her phone in her hand. He knew he should not do it. He knew exactly how this looked. But then Chloe smiled again, and somewhere deep down, the part of him that had never gotten over being left behind stepped forward. He gave her his number. On the subway ride home, he stared out the window and told himself it meant nothing. By the time he got back to the apartment, Jenica was asleep. The migraine medicine had finally knocked her out. She was curled up on her side facing the wall, one hand tucked under her cheek. The lamp beside the bed was still on. Michael stood there quietly for a second. Then he bent down and switched it off. As he slid into bed beside her, Jenica moved slightly in her sleep and reached for him without waking up. Her hand landed against his chest. For a moment, Michael closed his eyes. He should have let the night end there. Instead, a few seconds later, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Chloe, had fun tonight. You clean up nice." Michael stared at the screen, glowing in the dark. Then, while Jenica slept beside him, he texted back, "You don't look so bad yourself." At first, Michael told himself Chloe was just somebody from his past. That was all. An old chapter. A little harmless attention. Nothing serious. The texts stayed casual in the beginning. A joke here. A memory there. Chloe would send him pictures from expensive restaurants or hotel rooftops in cities he had never been to. Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles. Sometimes she sent pictures of herself too. Nothing obvious. Nothing he could not explain away. Just a mirror selfie before dinner. A black dress laid across a hotel bed. A glass of wine with a skyline in the background. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt something he had not felt in years. Anticipation. One Friday afternoon, Chloe texted him while he was in a meeting. Still pretending to be a respectable married man? Michael stared down at the message under the conference room table. He should not have smiled. But he did. That night, Jenica made pasta for dinner. She had sauce on her sleeve, and her hair tied up in the messy way Michael used to love. She was standing at the stove, talking about one of the kids at the arts program. "He made me a picture today," she said. It was supposed to be me, but honestly, it looked like George Washington. Michael laughed automatically, but he was barely listening. His phone buzzed on the counter. Jenica glanced toward it. "You've been on your phone a lot lately." Michael looked up too quickly. "It's work." Jenica nodded slowly. "Okay." He hated himself for lying, but not enough to stop. A few weeks later, he met Chloe for lunch. He told Jenica he had a client meeting downtown. Instead, he spent 2 hours sitting across from Chloe at a rooftop restaurant in Manhattan where the cheapest drink on the menu cost $20. Chloe wore sunglasses, even though they were sitting under an umbrella. "You know," she said, stirring her drink, "I always knew you'd end up doing well." Michael smiled. "You did not." "I did. You literally left me because you thought I had no future." Chloe looked down at her glass. I was young. You were cruel. She looked back up at him. And now look at you. Michael said nothing. Chloe leaned forward slightly. You've changed. How? You carry yourself differently. She smiled, more confident, more expensive. Michael laughed. Expensive? You know what I mean. The truth was, he did know what she meant. He had started buying better suits, better shoes, watches he could not really afford. He told himself it was because he needed to look the part now, but part of him also liked the way people looked at him when he walked into a room, especially Chloe. Over the next few months, the lunches turned into dinners. The dinners turned into nights where Michael came home late, smelling like whiskey and expensive cologne. At first, Jenica tried not to think too much about it. His career was growing. He was busy. He was stressed. But little things started changing. Michael used to come home and tell her about his day. Now he barely talked. He used to sit on the couch with her at night. Now he stayed on his phone. He used to laugh when she made fun of him. Now he seemed irritated by things he once loved about her. One Saturday morning, Jenica walked into the kitchen wearing one of his old college sweatshirts and fuzzy socks. Michael looked up from his phone. You can't wear that when people come over. She frowned. When who comes over? The guys from work. I told you, they're stopping by later before the game. Jenica looked down at herself. It's a sweatshirt. It's an ugly sweatshirt. She stared at him. For a second, he looked uncomfortable. Then he sighed. You know what I mean. No, she thought. I don't. Another night, they were supposed to have dinner with Denise and Grandma Ruth. Michael canceled an hour before. Something came up. Jenica stood in the bedroom doorway, holding the earrings she had been about to put on. You promised. I know. You missed last month too. Michael kept nodding his tie in the mirror. This is important. So is my family. He looked annoyed. Everything can't always be about your family, Jenica. The room went quiet, because for years, Michael had loved her family. Now he said the word family like it was a burden. Jenica looked at him. Who are you becoming? Michael looked away first. Meanwhile, Chloe kept feeding the worst parts of him. One night, they were sitting at a hotel bar after one of his business events. She was wearing a red dress. Michael had already had too much to drink. You know what your problem is? Chloe said. Michael laughed. Where do I start? You still act like you're the guy from Staten Island who thinks he has to apologize for existing. Michael looked down at his drink. You don't know what you're talking about. I do. She leaned closer. You've outgrown that life, Michael. What life? The little apartment, the thrift store wife, the pretending not to care about money. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. He should have defended Jenica. He should have gotten up and left. Instead, he sat there, because some ugly, selfish part of him had already started to believe Chloe was right. Back at home, Jenica kept trying. She suggested date nights. Michael canceled. She asked if he wanted to go to Prospect Park one Saturday, like they used to. He said he had work. She bought tickets to a Knicks game because he used to love going. Michael barely looked up from his laptop. Can we do it another time? Little by little, she started feeling alone inside her own marriage. One Thursday night, Jenica sat on the couch in the apartment with the television on low. It was after midnight. Michael had texted at 9, running late. Don't wait up. She had heard that sentence so many times by then that it barely felt real anymore. The apartment was dark except for the lamp beside her. Dinner sat untouched on the stove. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Jenica pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the clock again. Then she looked at the empty side of the couch beside her, and for the first time, she let herself admit what she had been trying not to see. Michael was already leaving her. He just had not said it out loud yet. By the time Michael asked Jenica to come to the dinner, she almost said no. It was a Thursday night in December. She had just gotten home from work and was standing in the kitchen in socks, eating cereal out of the box because she was too tired to cook. Michael walked into the apartment still wearing his coat. There's a dinner tomorrow night, he said. Jenica looked up. Okay. My firm wants spouses there. She waited. It had been weeks since he had wanted her anywhere near his work life. You want me to come? Michael hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Yeah, he said. "I think it would look weird if you didn't." The words stung more than she expected. Not "I want you there," not "I miss you." It would look weird. Still, she nodded. "Okay." The next night, Jenica stood in the bedroom staring at her closet. She owned exactly one dress she thought might work, a dark green one she had worn to a wedding 2 years earlier. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror. For a second, she almost changed. She suddenly felt too plain, too ordinary. The dress looked simple. Her shoes were old. Her hair would not do what she wanted. Behind her, Michael was adjusting his cufflinks. "You almost ready?" Jenica looked at him in the mirror. He looked different these days. Sharper, more polished, more like the men he worked with. "Do I look okay?" she asked quietly. Michael glanced at her. "Yeah. Just yeah. No smile. No, you look beautiful." Jenica looked back at herself in the mirror and tried to ignore the small ache in her chest. The restaurant was in Midtown Manhattan on the top floor of a building with a lobby so expensive it did not even look real. Everything gleamed. The hostess wore black gloves. There were candles on the tables and flowers that probably cost more than Jenica's monthly grocery bill. Michael spent the elevator ride checking his phone. When they walked into the private dining room, conversation stopped for a second. Then everybody smiled the way people do at events like that. Too polite, too careful. Michael introduced her to people whose names she forgot immediately. Investors, partners, wives. The women all looked beautiful in a way that seemed effortless and impossible at the same time. One of them looked at Jenica's dress and smiled too brightly. "I love vintage." Jenica smiled back because she did not know what else to do. At dinner, she ended up seated between Michael and a man named Richard, who worked in private equity and talked like every sentence was a speech. Michael barely looked at her. Every time she tried to join the conversation, somebody interrupted. They talked about vacation homes, stocks, restaurants in places Jenica had never been. At one point, Richard turned toward her. "So, Jenica, what do you do?" She sat up a little. "I work at a nonprofit arts program for kids in Brooklyn." Richard nodded politely. "That sounds rewarding." Before Jenica could answer, Michael laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh people use when they are embarrassed. She likes pretending she's saving the world. The table laughed, not because it was funny, because nobody knew what else to do. Jenica looked at Michael. He was smiling into his wine glass. For a second, she thought maybe she had heard him wrong. Richard gave a small, uncomfortable smile. "Nothing wrong with that." "No, of course not," Michael said. "Jenica's always been into that stuff." That stuff, the arts program she loved, the children she cared about, the work that made her feel useful. Jenica felt heat rise into her face. She looked down at her plate. For the rest of dinner, she barely spoke. Then one of the women across the table asked where they lived. "Brooklyn Heights," Jenica said. Michael leaned back in his chair. "Only because she refuses to move." Jenica looked at him again. "What?" He laughed. "Come on, Jenica. You know it's true." The room had gone quiet. Michael took another sip of wine. "She likes playing poor." Nobody said anything. Jenica stared at him. For one awful second, she thought she might cry right there at the table, not because of what he said, because of the way he said it, like he was ashamed of her. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. By the time they got back into the car, Jenica had said almost nothing for over an hour. The city moved past the window outside in streaks of light. Michael loosened his tie. "You're being quiet." Jenica let out a short laugh. "I'm being quiet?" Michael looked over at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" She turned toward him. "Why would you say those things about me?" "What things?" "At dinner." Michael sighed immediately. The sound of it made something inside her collapse, like she was already exhausting him. "Jenica, I was joking." "No, you weren't. You're overreacting." She stared at him. "I am not overreacting. You always do this." "Do what?" "You make everything so emotional." For a second, she could not speak, because this was the same man who used to hold her hand on the Brooklyn Bridge because she was cold. The same man who used to sit in her mother's kitchen helping Aaliyah with fractions. Now he looked at her like she was a problem. "You embarrassed me," she said quietly. Michael looked back out the window. You don't understand the world I'm in now. Jenica went still. What does that mean? It means things are different. Different how? Michael rubbed his hand across his face. I've changed. No, Jenica said. You've become cruel. The car went silent. Michael did not answer. Jenica looked at him in the dark, at the man beside her, who looked exactly like her husband, and somehow nothing like him at all. Then, very quietly, she asked the question she had been afraid to ask for weeks. Is there someone else? Michael looked down. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He just sat there, staring at his hands. And somehow, that was worse. Jenica turned back toward the window before he could see the tears in her eyes. Outside, Christmas lights hung in apartment windows all over the city. Inside the car, her marriage ended. Not 2 weeks later, when Michael finally asked for a divorce, not when he moved out, right there, in the silence after her question. Because when the man you love cannot even look you in the eye anymore, part of you already knows the truth. Michael asked for the divorce on a Tuesday night. By then, they had barely spoken for almost a week. The apartment in Brooklyn Heights had become painfully quiet. They moved around each other, like strangers sharing a hotel room. Jenica slept facing the edge of the bed. Michael stayed out later and later. Sometimes she heard his phone buzzing in the kitchen after midnight. She never asked who it was again. There are some answers people already know before they hear them. That night, Jenica was sitting at the kitchen table, grading drawings from the arts program. One of the little girls had drawn a picture of a cat that somehow looked exactly like their principal. Jenica almost smiled at it. Then Michael walked into the kitchen. He still had his coat on. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked nervous, not guilty, not heartbroken, just nervous, like he was about to have an unpleasant conversation at work. Can we talk? He asked. Jenica put the drawing down carefully. Okay. Michael sat across from her. He kept rubbing his thumb against the edge of his watch, the expensive watch Chloe had told him to buy. I don't think this is working anymore. Jenica looked at him. The sad thing was, the words did not shock her. She had been waiting for them. Still, hearing them out loud felt like being pushed off something high and realizing halfway down that nobody was coming to catch you. Because of her? She asked quietly. Michael looked away. It's not just that. The words hit her harder than if he had simply said yes. Not just that, meaning he had let somebody else into the space that used to belong to them. Jenica folded her hands in her lap because they had started shaking. Do you love her? Michael was quiet for too long. I don't know. Jenica nodded once. That answer hurt more than anything else. Because she had spent years loving him with certainty, and now he was willing to throw their life away for something he did not even understand. Michael finally looked at her. I think we want different things. Jenica almost laughed. Different things, as if this was about neighborhoods or jobs or whether they wanted children, as if he had not slowly drifted away from her, one lie at a time. No, she said softly. I think you want to be the person you think she sees. Michael flinched. For a second, she saw it. The old Michael, the one who knew she was right. But then it disappeared. I'm sorry, he said. Jenica looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up. Okay. Michael blinked. Okay? You've already left, Michael. Her voice was calm. That seemed to upset him more than if she had screamed. She walked into the bedroom and closed the door. On the other side, she heard him standing in the kitchen for a long time. Then, eventually, she heard the front door open and close. The divorce moved quickly after that. Michael moved into Chloe's apartment in Manhattan less than 2 weeks later. He told himself it was temporary. But when he walked into her building for the first time, carrying boxes and garment bags and the expensive watch still on his wrist, he felt something close to triumph. Chloe's apartment looked exactly the way he imagined successful people lived. Tall windows, white furniture nobody actually sat on, bottles of expensive liquor lined up on a shelf. She kissed him at the door. Welcome home. For a while, Michael let himself believe he had won. He and Chloe went to restaurants where nobody looked at the prices. She introduced him to people who talked about private flights and beach houses and investment portfolios. When they walked into a room together, people looked at them. Michael had wanted that feeling for so long that he mistook it for happiness. Meanwhile, Jenica signed the divorce papers without asking for anything. No fight, no revenge, no dramatic scene. That almost bothered Michael more. A week after the papers were finalized, Jenica drove to her mother's house in Bedford-Stuyvesant. She made it all the way there before she finally broke. She parked outside the house and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard her fingers hurt. Then suddenly, she could not breathe. The tears came all at once, the kind that leave you gasping, the kind that make your chest hurt. A few minutes later, the passenger door opened. Denise got in without saying anything. She had probably seen Jenica's car through the front window. For a while, they just sat there. Jenica cried, with her face in her hands. Denise reached over and rubbed her back the way she used to when Jenica was little and had nightmares. "I don't understand," Jenica whispered finally. "I don't understand how he became this person." Denise looked out through the windshield. Maybe he was always afraid of not being enough. Jenica wiped at her face. "He used to be kind." "I know. Then what happened?" Her mother was quiet for a second. Then she said, very softly, "Some people become cruel when they finally start feeling important." Jenica closed her eyes, because deep down, she knew her mother was right. Over the next few months, she began rebuilding herself slowly. She went back to work, spent more time with her family, started taking long walks through Brooklyn again. At first, everything reminded her of Michael: the coffee shop in Park Slope, the pizza place near Prospect Park, the Brooklyn Bridge. But little by little, the memories stopped feeling sharp. And little by little, Jenica started remembering who she had been before she spent so much energy loving somebody who stopped seeing her clearly. Meanwhile, across the river, Michael stood in Chloe's apartment, looking out over Manhattan one night with a glass of whiskey in his hand. The city glittered below him. Chloe was getting dressed for another event behind him. Michael smiled at his reflection in the window. For the first time in his life, he thought he had finally chosen the better life. For the first few months, Michael barely noticed anything changing. He was too busy trying to keep up with Chloe's life. There was always somewhere to go: a dinner in Tribeca, a hotel opening downtown, drinks with investors, a weekend in the Hamptons that Chloe somehow insisted they had to attend. Michael bought clothes he could not afford and put dinners on credit cards he stopped checking. Every time he hesitated, Chloe rolled her eyes. "You worry too much. I just think maybe we should slow down a little." "Michael," she said, laughing softly, "you finally have the life you wanted. Stop acting scared of it." So he did, or at least he pretended to. Then, slowly, the calls started stopping. One morning, Michael walked into work expecting to hear back about a new project he had been sure he would get. Instead, his boss called him into the office. They went with another firm. Michael frowned. Why? His boss shrugged. No idea. A week later, another client disappeared. Then another. Michael started calling people who used to call him first. Most of them never called back. The men who had once acted like he belonged suddenly sounded distracted, busy, distant. One evening, Michael was at a networking event in Midtown, standing alone near the bar. 6 months earlier, people would have crowded around him. Now they nodded politely and kept walking. He watched one of his old business contacts laugh across the room with another man. Michael started toward him. Before he got there, the man glanced at him, hesitated, and then turned away. Something cold settled in Michael's stomach. Later that night, an older businessman named Arthur found him standing outside the ballroom smoking a cigarette. Arthur had known everybody in New York for 30 years. He was the kind of man who always looked slightly disappointed, even when he was smiling. "You look terrible," Arthur said. "Thanks." Arthur shrugged. "You do." Michael stared out at the street below. "I don't understand what happened." Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he sighed. "You really don't know, do you?" Michael turned toward him. "Know what?" Arthur took another drag from his cigarette. "Your ex-wife's father was the reason people gave you a chance." Michael felt his entire body go still. "What?" Arthur looked surprised. "Oh, you knew Jenica's father?" Michael asked. Arthur gave him a look. "Everybody knew." Michael stared at him. "No," he said slowly. "Jenica's father. He had money, but nothing. That man could get anybody in this city a meeting. Michael shook his head. That's not possible. Arthur laughed once. It absolutely is. Then he looked at Michael more carefully. You seriously didn't know? Michael could barely hear him anymore. Suddenly, every piece of the last few years came rushing back. The Henderson account, the introductions, the investors, the men who suddenly wanted his number, the opportunities that had appeared out of nowhere, not because he had earned them, because Jenica had quietly believed in him enough to ask somebody to open the door. And she had never taken credit. Michael leaned against the wall. For a second, he thought he might be sick. Arthur flicked ash off his cigarette. She must have loved you a lot. Michael closed his eyes, because she had, more than he had ever deserved. That night, he went home and looked around Chloe's apartment differently. For the first time, he noticed little things. The designer bags she left lying around still had tags inside them. The expensive paintings on the walls had been rented from somewhere. She talked about business constantly, but he had never actually seen her work. When he asked questions, she always changed the subject. One night, he found her sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. What exactly does your company do? He asked. Chloe looked up slowly. What? Your consulting business. She laughed lightly. You know what it does? No, Michael said. I actually don't. Her expression hardened for half a second. Then she smiled again. We connect luxury brands with investors. Which brands? Michael, why are you interrogating me? I'm not interrogating you. Then what are you doing? He stared at her, because for the first time, he realized he had no real answer. He didn't actually know anything about her life, only the version she wanted him to see. A few days later, Michael did something he had never done before. He searched her company online. There was almost nothing there. A website that barely worked. A few vague articles. No real office address. The photos on her social media suddenly looked different too. The same hotel rooms appearing again and again. The same expensive car in different angles. One of the pictures from Paris had actually been taken at a hotel in Manhattan. Michael sat staring at the screen long after midnight. Then, he looked around the apartment again. The truth was sitting everywhere. He had just not wanted to see it. By then, he had already spent almost all his savings trying to keep up with her. The watch, the suits, the trips, the apartment, everything he thought made him look successful. Everything he thought would finally make him enough. 3 nights later, Michael came home early. The meeting he had been counting on was canceled at the last minute. He let himself into the apartment quietly. At first, he heard voices, then laughter. A man's laughter. Michael stopped in the hallway. The living room lights were on. He stepped around the corner. Chloe was sitting on the couch with one of his business contacts. Richard, the same Richard from the dinner where Michael humiliated Jenica. Richard had one arm stretched across the back of the couch. Chloe was holding a glass of wine. Neither of them looked surprised to see him. For a second, nobody moved. Then Chloe sighed. You're home early. Michael stared at her. What is this? Richard stood up awkwardly. Michael, listen. No, Michael said. He looked at Chloe. What is this? She rolled her eyes like he was being unreasonable. Oh my God. Michael could barely breathe. Are you serious? Chloe stood up slowly and set down her wine glass. You can't seriously think I was going to stay with you forever. Michael looked at her like he did not know who she was. You said you loved me. Chloe laughed, not kindly. Michael, she said, you were useful. The room went completely silent. Then she looked him up and down. And now you're broke. Michael stood there in the middle of the apartment he had paid for, staring at the woman he had destroyed his life for. And for the first time, he finally understood exactly what he had done to Jenica. Richard left first. He grabbed his coat, muttered something that sounded like sorry, and slipped past Michael without making eye contact. Michael barely noticed. He was still staring at Chloe. She walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened and poured herself another glass of wine. You don't get to do this, Michael said. Chloe looked over her shoulder. Do what? You don't get to act like I'm the idiot here. She laughed once. But you are. The words hit him harder than he expected, not because they were cruel, because some part of him knew she was right. He had walked away from a woman who loved him for exactly who he was. For this. For a woman who had only ever loved the version of him she thought could buy her something. Chloe took a sip of wine. You really thought we were going to ride off into the sunset together? Michael stared at her. I left my wife for you. And whose fault is that? For a second, he could not speak, because there it was, the ugliest truth of all. Chloe had lied to him, used him, manipulated him, but she had not forced him to betray Jenica. That part belonged to him. Michael looked around the apartment. The white couch, the expensive art, the view of the city. A few months earlier, all of it had felt like proof that he had finally become somebody. Now it just looked empty. When are you leaving? Chloe asked. He looked back at her. What? The apartment's in my name. Michael laughed bitterly. Of course it was. You're throwing me out? Chloe shrugged. I already told you. I don't stay with men who can't keep up. Then she picked up her phone and walked into the bedroom. Michael stood alone in the living room for a long time. Then finally, quietly, he went into the guest room and started putting his clothes into a suitcase. By the end of the month, almost everything was gone. The savings account he had spent years building, the expensive watch, the new suits. The credit cards were nearly maxed out. His job cut him loose 2 weeks later. Officially, they said they were restructuring. Unofficially, Michael knew the truth. He was no longer useful. He moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Queens above a laundromat. The hallway smelled like bleach and old cigarettes. The radiator clanged all night. The kitchen was so small he had to stand sideways to open the refrigerator. The first night there, he sat on the floor, eating cold takeout straight from the carton because he had not unpacked the dishes yet. The silence in the apartment felt unbearable. For years he had complained that Jenica talked too much. Now he would have given anything to hear her voice in the next room. As the weeks passed, Michael started selling things. First, the watch, then the suits, then the car. One afternoon, he stood in a pawn shop, holding the wedding ring he had stopped wearing months earlier. The man behind the counter looked at it. You sure? Michael stared at the ring in his hand. He remembered the night he gave it to Jenica in their kitchen, while she sat on the counter eating lo mein. He remembered her laughing and crying at the same time. You idiot. For a second, he almost walked out. Instead, he handed the ring over. At night, the memories came whether he wanted them to or not. Not the big moments, the small ones. Jenica singing badly while she cooked. Jenica falling asleep on the couch with a book in her lap. The way she used to squeeze his hand under the table when she knew he was nervous. The time she stood in the rain outside his office because he had a terrible day and she wanted to surprise him with coffee. He had forgotten that one until now. It had been years earlier. He came out of the building angry because he had lost a client. Jenica was standing across the street under a broken umbrella, holding 2 cups from his favorite coffee place. You looked like you were having a bad day, she had said. He had not even thanked her properly. He had just complained the coffee was probably cold. Now he sat alone in Queens and thought about that moment until his chest hurt. The worst part was realizing how many times she had loved him in ways he barely noticed. One Sunday, Michael called Danny. His younger brother answered on the 3rd ring. You alive? Danny asked. Michael laughed weakly. Barely. There was a pause. Then Danny said quietly, I heard about you and Jenica. Michael closed his eyes. Yeah, you really screwed that up. Michael leaned back against the wall. I know. Danny was quiet for a second. Then he said, she was good to you. Michael looked around the apartment, at the peeling paint, the boxes he still had not unpacked, the life he had destroyed with his own hands. I know, he said again. That night, he called Jenica. It rang 4 times, then voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. The next night, he texted her, I'm sorry. No answer. A few days later, I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? Nothing. Then, I just want you to know you were right about me. Still nothing. Weeks passed. Michael kept texting anyway, sometimes late at night, sometimes after too much whiskey, sometimes after waking up from dreams where he was back in the old apartment and Jenica was still there. He never got a response. Because somewhere in Brooklyn, Jenica was learning how to live without him. And somewhere in Queens, Michael was finally learning what it meant to lose everything that mattered. Almost a year passed before Michael saw Jenica again. By then, spring had come back to Brooklyn. The trees were green again. Sidewalk cafes had dragged their little metal tables back outside. People walked through the neighborhood with coffee in one hand and sunglasses pushed up into their hair like winter had never happened. Michael had gone to Brooklyn that afternoon because he had a job interview downtown. It was not the kind of job interview he used to have. No expensive office, no polished conference room, just a small property management company looking for somebody to handle leases and paperwork. The interview lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, Michael walked toward the subway with his hands in his pockets and his tie loosened at the collar. He passed a small park in Brooklyn Heights, and then he saw her. At first, he was not even sure it was Jenica. She was standing near a bench in jeans and a light sweater with her hair pulled back. There was a diaper bag hanging from one shoulder. She looked different, not because of her clothes, because she looked lighter somehow, like somebody who had finally put down something heavy. Then she turned slightly, and Michael saw the baby, a little girl with round cheeks and a pink jacket sitting on Jenica's hip. Michael stopped walking. For a second, the whole world seemed to go quiet around him. Jenica smiled down at the little girl. The baby laughed and grabbed a piece of Jenica's hair. Then a man walked over carrying 2 coffees. He was tall, maybe a few years older than Michael, with tired eyes and the kind of face that looked kind even when he was not smiling. He handed 1 coffee to Jenica. "You want the lid off?" "No, she'll absolutely throw it." The man laughed. The baby reached for him immediately. "Traitor," Jenica said. He took the little girl from her and kissed the top of her head without thinking about it. The ease of it hit Michael harder than he expected, because the man looked comfortable beside Jenica, not like he was trying to impress her, not like he was trying to become something, just like he loved her. And Jenica looked at him the way she used to look at Michael, only maybe softer, maybe safer. Michael felt something painful twist in his chest, because for the first time, he was seeing what his life could have been if he had not destroyed it. The little girl pointed toward the swings. The man looked at Jenica. "I'll take her." Jenica smiled. "You're wrapped around her finger already." "She's very persuasive." He walked toward the playground carrying the little girl on his shoulders. Jenica stood there watching them. Then she turned and saw Michael. For a second, neither of them moved. The expression on Jenica's face was not anger. That would have been easier. It was surprise, then something gentler, something sad. Michael walked toward her slowly. "Hi," he said. Jenica held the coffee cup a little tighter. "Hi." He glanced toward the playground. The little girl was laughing while the man pushed her on the swing. "Your daughter?" Jenica nodded. "Yeah. She's beautiful." A small smile crossed Jenica's face. "Thank you." Michael looked at her. Up close, she looked good, healthy, at peace. There were still parts of the old Jenica there, the same eyes, the same quiet way of looking at people. But there was something new too, strength, the kind people get after surviving something they never should have had to survive. Michael shoved his hands into his pockets. "I've called you," he said quietly. "A lot." "I know. You never answered." Jenica looked down at her coffee. "I didn't know what to say." Michael nodded. That was fair. More than fair. The man at the playground looked over toward them. Jenica lifted a hand slightly to let him know everything was okay. Then she looked back at Michael. He could think of 1,000 things he wanted to say. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I ruined everything." But standing there in front of her, none of it felt big enough. Instead, he looked toward the little girl again. "She looks happy," he said. Jenica followed his eyes. "She is. And you?" Jenica was quiet for a second. Then she nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "I am." Michael looked down, because that was the moment he finally understood something. Jenica had not spent the last year waiting for him to come back. She had spent the last year learning how to live without him, and somehow she had built something beautiful from the pieces he left behind. Michael looked back up at her. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice rough. "But can we talk?" Jenica looked toward the playground again. The little girl was still laughing on the swing, while the man stood nearby, holding both coffee cups now. He looked over once, just long enough to make sure she was okay. Jenica gave him a small nod. Then she looked back at Michael, just for a minute. They walked a few feet away to an empty bench beneath a tree that had started blooming again. For a second, neither of them said anything. The sounds of the park filled the silence. Kids yelling, a dog barking somewhere, a train rumbling in the distance. Michael sat with his hands clasped together between his knees. Jenica stayed standing for a moment, before finally sitting at the far end of the bench. There was space between them. Too much space to ever cross again. Michael stared down at the sidewalk. "I've replayed it 1,000 times," he said quietly. Jenica did not answer. "The dinner, the things I said to you, the way I acted." He swallowed. "I don't know who that person was." Jenica looked at him. "Yes, you do." The words were not cruel. That somehow made them hurt more. Michael rubbed his face with both hands. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if Chloe wanted me, then maybe that meant I had finally become somebody." Jenica looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. "You always were somebody." Michael laughed bitterly. "I know that now." "No," she said softly. "You know it because you lost everything. That's different." He looked at her. There it was. The truth. Jenica had loved him when he had nothing, and instead of letting that heal him, he had spent years chasing the approval of the one person who made him feel small. "I found out about my career," he said quietly. Jenica's face changed slightly. "My father told you?" "No, Arthur." She nodded once. Michael looked at her. "You helped me. You were talented." "No." He shook his head. "You opened doors for me." Jenica stared out toward the playground. "I just wanted people to see what I saw." Michael closed his eyes. "And I treated you like you were holding me back." Jenica was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very softly, "That was the part that hurt the most." Michael looked at her. "Not that you loved somebody else, not even that you left. It was that you made me feel small for being the same person you used to love." The wind moved through the trees above them. Michael could not look at her. Because she was right. He had mocked her work, her clothes, her kindness, all the things that once made him fall in love with her. "I was ashamed," he admitted. Jenica turned toward him. "Of me?" "No." He shook his head quickly. "Of myself." For the first time since they sat down, Jenica's expression softened a little. Michael looked at the ground. "I spent so much of my life trying to prove I mattered. And when Chloe came back—" He let out a long breath. "She said all the things I wanted to hear. That you were successful." He looked at her in surprise. Jenica gave a sad little smile. "You used to talk in your sleep." Despite everything, Michael almost laughed. Then his face fell again. "I threw away the one person who loved me before any of that." Jenica looked down at her daughter's pink hat sitting on the bench between them. "When you left," she said quietly, "I kept wondering what was wrong with me." Michael looked up immediately. "Nothing. I know that now." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "But at the time—" She paused. "At the time I thought maybe if I had dressed differently, or cared more about money, or acted more like the people you wanted to impress." Her voice caught for the first time. Michael felt like somebody had punched him in the chest. "Jenica." She shook her head. "But then one day, I realized something." She looked at him. "You did not leave because I wasn't enough." Michael could not speak. "You left because no matter how much I loved you, it was never going to fix the part of you that believed you weren't enough." The words settled between them, heavy. True. Michael looked away because he could not stand the look in her eyes. Not anger, not even hatred, just the sadness of somebody who had once known him better than he knew himself. He swallowed hard. "I am so sorry." Jenica nodded slowly. "I know. I would do anything to take it back." She looked toward the playground again. The little girl was reaching both arms toward the man standing beside the swings. He picked her up immediately. Easy, natural, certain. Jenica smiled without thinking. Then she looked back at Michael. "Michael," she said softly, "some people come into your life to teach you what love looks like." He stared at her. "And other people come into your life to teach you what happens when you take it for granted." Michael felt his throat tighten. because he knew exactly which person he had been. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, quietly, he asked the question he had been carrying for over a year. "Do you ever miss me?" Jenica looked down at her coffee cup. For a second, Michael thought maybe she was not going to answer. The park around them kept moving, like nothing important was happening. A little boy ran past with one shoe untied. Somebody across the street was arguing into a phone. The baby on the swings laughed again. Then Jenica looked back at him. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice stayed steady. "I miss who I thought you were." Michael closed his eyes, because there was nothing to defend himself against in that answer. She was right. The man she missed was the one who sat with her on the fire escape eating Chinese takeout. The one who carried her coffee when her hands were cold. The one who cried during his wedding vows and promised he would never forget what a gift she was. The man she loved had been real, but so had the man who betrayed her. And somewhere along the way, one of them had become stronger than the other. Jenica stood up slowly. Michael looked up at her. "I really did love you," he said. She nodded. "I know, and I still." He stopped, because what was the point? Love did not mean much when it arrived after the damage was done. Love did not undo humiliation. It did not erase lonely nights, or silence, or betrayal. Jenica looked toward the playground where the man and the little girl were waiting for her. The little girl saw her and held both arms up immediately. Jenica smiled. That smile hurt Michael more than anything, not because it was meant for somebody else, because it was the smile she used to save for him. "I hope you find peace, Michael," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away. Michael stayed on the bench. He watched her cross the park. The man handed her one of the coffees. She kissed the top of her daughter's head. Then the three of them walked away together. Jenica never looked back. Michael sat there long after they were gone. The sky had started turning orange above Brooklyn. People passed him without noticing. For the first time in his life, there was nobody left to blame. Not Chloe, not bad timing, not work, not the world, just himself. He had spent years chasing the people who bruised his ego because he thought their approval would finally make him feel worthy. Meanwhile, he ignored the person who had spent every day quietly loving him exactly as he was. Jenica never asked him to be richer, or smarter, or more impressive. She only asked him to let himself be loved, and he had thrown that away because he wanted the wrong person to finally tell him he mattered. The cruelest part was that Chloe had never really loved him at all, but Jenica had. She loved him when he felt small. She believed in him when he doubted himself. She helped him when he did not even know he needed help. And instead of appreciating that, he mistook it for something ordinary. Michael looked down at his empty hands. There had been a time when those hands held everything he wanted. Jenica's hand on the subway platform. Jenica's hand in the kitchen while they cooked dinner. Jenica's hand under the table when she knew he was nervous. Now there was nothing. Just a man sitting alone in a park, finally understanding the lesson too late. Some people spend their whole lives chasing the person who wounds their pride while ignoring the person who heals their heart. And sometimes the worst mistake is not losing everything. It is realizing, far too late, that you already had everything you needed. For a long time after that day, Michael still walked past that park sometimes. Not because he expected to see Jenica again. Deep down, he knew he never would. He went because there are some places that remind you of the exact moment your life changed. The exact moment you finally stopped lying to yourself. And every time he sat on that same bench, he thought about something Jenica once said years earlier in the tiny apartment in Brooklyn Heights. "I'm not broke on purpose," she had said, laughing while she unpacked thrift store dishes into crooked kitchen cabinets. "I'm normal on purpose." Back then, Michael had not understood what she meant. Now he did. Jenica had never wanted the life he chased. She wanted honesty, peace, family, a person who could sit beside her in an ordinary kitchen and understand that love is not built in big moments. It is built in small ones, in staying, in kindness, in choosing the same person over and over, even after life stops being exciting. Michael had spent years thinking success meant being admired. Jenica taught him, too late, that real success is being loved by somebody good and having the wisdom not to throw that away. If this story touched you, take a second and ask yourself, have you ever pushed away someone who truly loved you while chasing someone who only fed your ego? And if you've ever been Jenica, if you've ever loved someone who could not see your value until it was too late, I want you to remember this. The right people will never make you feel small for being who you are. Comment below. Was Michael ever truly sorry? Or was he only sorry after he lost everything? And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the Mr. Graham family. There are more real stories coming that might change the way you see your own life.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.